I'm Tim Riesen. I'm the Director of Research and Training at the Institute for Disability Research, Policy, and Practice at Utah State University. In this webinar, I'm going to talk about work-based learning experiences for students with disabilities and how we ensure these experiences align with the Fair Labor Standards Act. There are a number of objectives that I hope to accomplish throughout this webinar. First, I'm going to establish the importance of early work experiences for students with disabilities. Second, I'm going to provide an operational definition of work-based learning activities that are commonly implemented in secondary settings. Third, I'm going to talk about how we align work-based learning experiences with the Fair Labor Standards Act. In particular, I want to talk about how we define an employer-employee relationship, how we develop work-based learning activities that align with child labor, how we develop internships, how we develop work-related training that meets the 64 CO8 requirements that are established by the Department of Labor's Wage and Hour Division, how we facilitate volunteer activities for students with disabilities. I'll conclude the webinar with some general recommendations about just improving work-based learning experiences for students with disabilities. So, as you all probably know, the transition mandate was enacted by Congress in 1990. The purpose of this mandate was to develop a coordinated set of activities that facilitate the movement of a student with a disability from school to post-school activities that include vocational education, that include integrated employment, such as supported employment or customized employment. Now, this transition mandate was in direct response to the poor employment outcomes that students with disabilities were obtaining. So prior to the transition mandate, we found that students with disabilities were not exiting into employment, and that the outcomes for these students, particularly those with more significant disabilities, were pretty dismal. So Congress added the transition mandate with the reauthorization in 1990. But despite this mandate, we've made only small gains in employment, especially for students with significant disabilities. So I want to spend a little bit of time examining some employment outcomes, because I think these outcomes really help illustrate the importance of establishing meaningful and applied work experiences for students with disabilities, especially for students with more significant disabilities. So there are a number of data sets or a number of employment data sets that we look at when we talk about employment outcomes. One of these data sets is the American Community Survey, which is an annual supplement to the United States Census. So these data really look at a lot of social and economic factors of all Americans. One of the data sets or data variables is the employment, whether or not individuals are employed or not employed. So according to the ACS, approximately 45% of people with disabilities in the United States between the ages of 21 and 65 are employed full or part-time. So this includes a wide range of disability, including visual disabilities, hearing disabilities, ambulatory disabilities, cognitive disabilities, self-care disabilities, and independent living disabilities. So it's a wide range of disabilities. When you start distilling these data down and start looking at disability-specific data, and especially disability-specific data related to the individuals that are served in special education, we see some precipitous declines in employment outcomes for individuals. So, for example, the American Community Survey reports that only 39% of individuals with cognitive disabilities are employed full or part-time. When you look at individuals who are receiving services through intellectual and developmental disabilities in states, we see some pretty significant gaps in terms of employment. So the data that I'm showing you on the screen is from the state data, the National Report on Employment Services and Outcomes, that's reported by the University of Massachusetts, the Institute for Community Inclusion. Now, these data report outcomes for individuals who are receiving home and community-based services waivers, so HCBS waivers, and they're served by their state DD agencies. So when you look at these data or this chart, you see that only 21% of individuals with intellectual and developmental disabilities are employed in integrated employment, competitive integrated employment. The remainder, 78% of individuals, 78.5% of individuals, are engaged in facility-based work or non-work settings. So a facility-based work setting would be something like a shelter workshop, where an individual may be paid, typically they're paid sub-minimum wage, but it's a congregate setting. Everybody in that setting has a disability. And then a non-work setting would be something like a day program. Typically in day programs, we're not working on employment-related skills, typically working on other things such as social skills and adaptive skills. So these data really illustrate the importance of establishing meaningful and applied work experiences for students while they're in high school. Oftentimes, individuals that we support in transition settings will transition into vocational rehabilitation services at exit. So vocational rehabilitation provides a whole host of services that are aimed at helping an individual obtain employment. Two of these services include supported employment and customized employment. So a good proportion of the students that we're supporting, individuals with intellectual and developmental disabilities, individuals with autism, individuals with multiple disabilities, may engage in supported employment and customized employment at exit. So one of the things that I was interested in is looking at what happens or where individuals work when they're engaged in supported employment and customized employment. So my colleagues and I looked at the RSA 911 database. So each state is required to collect data on outcomes for individuals receiving services through vocational rehabilitation. We wanted to look at what's happening in regard to supported employment and customized employment. So we analyzed roughly 89,000 cases across the country of individuals who exited into competitive employment, competitive integrated employment through supported employment or customized employment for fiscal years 2017 to 2020. And what we found was pretty interesting. So we found that when individuals are receiving supported employment or customized employment and they exit into competitive integrated employment, the majority of the jobs that people with disabilities are getting are what we call the F jobs. So these include things like fast food, folding, and filth, right? So these F jobs. So the data that I have on the screen really show where people are working. And we compared this to the standard occupational classification system. So the standard occupational classification system is what the Department of Labor uses to categorize jobs. So we can compare and contrast where folks are working based on the standard occupational classification system. So our analysis showed that most people who are in supported or customized employment work in food preparation and service-related jobs, followed by office and administrative support, and then building and groundskeeping and maintenance. So people are working in these entry-level F jobs when they're receiving supported employment and customized employment. Now, what struck me about these data is that this does not necessarily represent the full range of employment outcomes that are possible for students with disabilities. So once again, these data really illustrate the importance of setting up high-quality work-based experiences so students can be exposed to the range of occupations that are out there. Some other data that some other interesting findings that we found from this study is that people with disabilities hourly wage is lower than people without disabilities performing the same work. So we looked at the U.S. Bureau of Labor Statistics hourly wage for specific occupations related to food prep, office support, groundskeeping and cleaning, and transportation and moving. So the wages that I'm showing you on the screen are the average hourly wage for these specific occupations across the country. So we wanted to see what individuals who were receiving supported employment and customized employment were paid at exit from vocational rehabilitation services. We found that individuals who who obtain competitive integrated employment through customized employment or supported employment were paid nearly $5 less an hour than the average hourly wage across the country. So this sets up an interesting kind of paradigm. We are preparing students with disabilities or individuals with disabilities with more complex support needs or significant support needs, such as intellectual and developmental disabilities, for these F jobs. And we're also paying these individuals less than the average hourly wage. So I really believe that these poor employment data reinforces the importance of setting up high quality, good employment experiences for youth while they're in school. So I want to spend a little bit of time talking about what these are. So we know that work-based learning is positively correlated to improved post-school outcomes. And we've known that since that predated the transition mandate of 1990. There were some seminal studies in the early 1980s conducted by Hazazi, Gordon, and Rowe that looked at individuals with intellectual and developmental disabilities who got a job prior to exiting school and what happened to that job once they exited school. And we found, or they found, that when an individual with an intellectual and developmental disability was paid in paid employment prior to exiting school, those individuals were more successful when they left. So we know that these experiences really lead to solid outcomes once a person exits school. So how do we get there? Well, there are a number of experiences that we can set up for an individual or students with disabilities during the transition years. And I really believe that we should build these experiences from a cumulative perspective. So we should start with exploration, move into assessment, move into training, and then get a paid job prior to exiting. So there are a number of ways we can do this. One of which is through informational interviews. So informational interviews is when a student goes and talks to an employer and learns about the demands of a specific job. So they're interviewing an employer about what they need to know to work in that specific environment. Then we can move into job shadowing. Job shadowing is another exploration kind of strategy where an individual shadows a person who's working at a specific job and watches them perform the demands of that job, and then can ask questions and take down notes or record videos of that person engaging in that job. We can engage in unpaid job training or situational type assessments, where a student is learning a specific skill related to the things that we've learned through our previous exploration and assessment strategies. A student can engage in internships, and these internships could either be paid or unpaid. I am a strong advocate for individuals or students with disabilities engaging in paid internships. I know, however, there are times when schools have set up unpaid internships. And oftentimes these unpaid internships are set up for students who just have not really been exposed to the demands of work and really need to learn some skills in regard to work. So there are instances where unpaid internships have some utility. And then finally, we want to move an individual into paid employment. So once again, going back to those seminal studies, paid employment is just a predictor of better success. So we hope that through these experiences, that these will help shape the work identities for youth and young adults with and without disabilities, and will help create a pathway to meaningful post-school work. That we can get out of this F-job paradigm, which people are working in when they leave school, that we want to expose them to the range of jobs. So we need to help a student learn really important soft skills. And we know that soft skills are one of the most important parts of a job. So there have actually been studies that are out there that really show that individuals are oftentimes fired for lack of soft skills, not lack of hard skills, because we can teach hard skills. If there are a lack of soft skills, that becomes a detriment to employment. We also want to help an individual learn hard skills. We can help an individual learn financial or time management, so on and so forth. Those are the whole host of things that we're hopefully exposing a student to through these work-based learning experiences. So when educators are setting up these work-based learning experiences, it's really important that you understand how to align these experiences with the Fair Labor Standards Act. So the Fair Labor Standards Act was enacted in 1938 to establish a federal minimum wage, to regulate working hours, to regulate child labor, and to really ensure that we had equal pay for all employees. So it was really designed to protect all workers in the United States. The Department of Labor and the Wage and Hour Division's Field Operational Handbook provides a lot of interpretive guidance for the Fair Labor Standards Act, and this is what I'm going to be referencing throughout the remaining portions of this presentation. So there are several things that you, as educators who are setting up work-based learning experiences or activities for students with disabilities, really need to understand. And one of the most important provisions is this idea of an employer-employee relationship. And I'll talk about that here momentarily. You should also understand that there's specific child labor provisions. So students under age 18 are prohibited from working in hazardous occupations, and I'll explore those here momentarily. If you're setting up an unpaid internships, there are things that you need to ensure are happening so that employer-employee relationship does not exist. Same holds true for unpaid job training. And then there are certain things that folks are transition professionals need to understand about volunteering as well, that are outlined in the Wage and Hour Division's Field Operation Handbook. So let's go ahead and tackle the employer-employee relationship, because this is the foundation of everything that I'm going to be talking about. So when we're engaged in work-based learning experiences, the provisions of the Fair Labor Standards Act are triggered anytime there's an employer-employee relationship. So that means that when there's an employee-employer relationship, then those provisions of the Fair Labor Standards Act kick in, and that student should be paid at least the federal minimum wage standard, which right now is $7.25 an hour. Now, if states go above and beyond that federal minimum wage standard, then they should be paid whatever that state's standard is. So this is important for you to just think about. If there's an employee-employer relationship, then the student needs to be paid at least the federal minimum wage standard. So how do we determine whether or not there's an employee-employer relationship? Well, let's look at that relationship. First and foremost, that work is performed as an integral part of the business. So if a student is engaged in a training in a training program at a specific business, and if that student wasn't there doing the training activities, and then a component of that business wouldn't happen, then that work is an integral part of that business. So we really need to make sure that the experiences that we're setting up for students with disabilities do not displace regular workers in that business. That if the employer implements mandatory work schedules, if the employer maintains work records or employment records, and of course, if the employer is paying somebody, then those provisions of the Fair Labor Standards Act kick in, meaning you have to pay them at least minimum wage, you guaranteed overtime protection, benefits, so on and so forth. So when there's a non-employment relationship, you meet the provisions of 64 CO8, which I'll talk about here momentarily, or you meet the test for unpaid internships. So always keep in mind this idea of employer-employee relationship when you're setting up these work-based learning experiences. So before we get into those 64 CO8 and internships, let's briefly explore some child labor provisions that are important to highlight. So all youth who are younger than 18 years old are prohibited from working in 17 occupations that are declared hazardous by the Secretary of Labor. I didn't include all of these occupations. I did, however, include a link at the bottom of this picture and then at the conclusion of this webinar as well that lists all these occupations. And this website that I identified here is targeted towards educators. So this might be something good to just highlight or bookmark on your computer when you're starting to set up work-based learning activities so you can understand what these hazardous occupations are. I'm going to highlight just a couple of them that probably you all would encounter when you're setting up a work-based learning experience. So youth, individuals under age 18 who are not emancipated are prohibited from using power-driven bakery machines. And I bring this up because going back to those jobs that I just talked about, those F jobs, the jobs that we're seeing people go transition into in terms of outcomes, working in restaurants is one of them. So odds are they're going to be exposed to those heavy duty mixing machines. So you all know, if you've been in a restaurant, you all know what I'm talking about, the big Hobart machines. They're big industrial mixing machines. Students under age 18 are not, cannot work with one of those machines. There are however, exceptions. So it allows individuals 16 and 17-year-old to operate certain lightweight, small, portable countertop mixers and certain pizza dough rollers under certain conditions. So it's really important when you're setting up this stuff, if you're in a restaurant, you got to make sure that that student's not engaged in using those heavy duty machines. Other things, I just listed a few other occupations, hazardous occupations. If there's exposure to radioactive substances or radiation, not a good place to set up a work-based learning experience, or power-driven hoisting apparatus, so on and so forth. So according to the Department of Labor, the most common violations related to child labor violations are working longer hours or later than legally allowed. So there's also stipulations about how long an individual can work based on age, driving a motor vehicle or a forklift, and finally using a meat processing machine or a vertical dough or batter mixer. So there are actual fines and violations for businesses when they violate child labor. In Utah, where I'm from, there was just a company that makes cookies here in Utah, a cookie company, and they were just fined, I think, right around $58,000, the franchise, because of students who were younger than 16 were working longer hours than allowed by the Fair Labor Standards Act. So check out this youth rule webpage that I have. It identifies all the youth hours, it provides all the occupations. It will just be a really nice resource for you all when you're setting up work-based learning experiences. So let's shift to unpaid internships. So once again, I'm a strong advocate for having paid internships for students with disabilities. I know, however, that there are instances where we may want to set up an unpaid internship for a student who hasn't necessarily had a lot of exposure to work, who's working on some soft skills, who we really need to just expose to the demands of work. So if that's the case, then we have to be cognizant of this fact sheet or the 7-factor test that's described by the Wage and Hour Division. So it's important to understand when we're talking about internships, the term internship isn't defined in the Fair Labor Standards Act. And traditionally disputes whether an unpaid internship as an employee under the Fair Labor Standard Act has been resolved by the court. So there's not language in the act that talks about internships. There's not language in the Wage and Hour Division's field operation handbook that talks about internships. It's all driven by the court system. But the Wage and Hour Division has come up with these fact sheets that use these court decisions to really determine whether or not, or to help us figure out whether or not an internship should be paid and whether or not there's that employee employer relationship. So here are the considerations. First, the intern and the employer must understand that compensation is not expected for tasks completed. Second, the internship provides training similar to what is provided in an educational setting. Third, the internship is tied to an educational program by integrating coursework or providing credit. Fourth, the internship accommodates the intern's academic commitments by aligning with the intern's academic calendar. Fifth, the length, hours, and learning objectives of the internship should be agreed upon in advance, with the length of the internship focused on the learning of the intern rather than benefiting the employer. Sixth, the tasks completed by the internship do not displace the work of paid employees. And seventh, and finally, both the intern and the employer acknowledge there's no expectation for permanent employment at the completion of the internship. So you can see that these are really designed to ensure that there's not that employer-employee relationship. If there's that relationship and that student's engaged in that internship, and we violated some of these tests here, then the student must be paid for that work or for engaging in that internship. So how do we ensure that we're meeting these guidelines? I recommend that whenever we're engaged in a unpaid scenario, that we develop written agreements with the employer, the student, and it outlines what we're going to be doing in each one of these scenarios. So if you're developing a written agreement, this agreement should address each one of those 7 factors. So first thing you should do is identify that there is, if there's an expectation of compensation. So on the agreement, say there's no expectation for compensation. This is an unpaid internship. Second, you should identify what education and training will be provided. So you could simply say something like the student in this internship is going to learn to use written communication skills. They're going to take work orders or whatever you're working on with that specific internship. Third, you're going to identify how the internship is tied to coursework. So you could say something like the student is enrolled in a CTE course to learn business and management skills, and the internship is really designed to help this student explore these skills. Fourth, identify how the internship corresponds to the academic calendar. So you could simply just say something like the initial course and internship will be offered during the fall semester. Just you're outlining each one of these criteria. Fifth, match the length of the internship with the educational benefit to the student. So identify how long this is going to be. So you could say something like the internship will be 12 weeks in duration, and this matches the school calendar for the CTE course. Sixth, ensure that there's no displacement of work for other paid employees or stakeholders. So the internship, you could just say something like, explain what the intern's going to do. The intern will learn the soft skills such as greeting customers, so on and so forth, and that they're not going to be displacing any workers within this environment. And finally, communicate the understanding that there's no guarantee of a job after completing the internship. So just make this statement at the end of the agreement that there's no guarantee that the student will be employed. So these are designed, or these criteria are really designed to ensure that that employee-employer relationship doesn't exist. And if it does exist, once again, that student should be paid for that internship. So other things that happen in schools, in transition settings, when you're setting up work-based learning experiences, are things like vocational exploration, assessment, and training. So the Field Operations Handbook under Section 64 CO8 has specific criteria for each one of these experiences, and they outline it in the Operations Handbook. So there are a number of criteria that you have to be aware of if you're engaging in these specific activities. First and foremost, if you're engaging in these activities, students have to be individuals with a physical or mental disability for whom competitive integrated employment at or above the minimum wage is not immediately available. So typically we're setting these things up, engaging in these experiences for students with significant support needs, a student with significant disabilities, who haven't necessarily been exposed to the demands of work. So we're engaging in this exploration process. Second, participation in the vocational activity is supervised by the school staff and is for the purpose of vocational exploration, assessment, and or training in a community-based work site. Now, this 64 CO8 stipulates certain hour requirements for each one of these provisions. So if you're engaged in vocational exploration, it's 5 hours per job experience. If you're engaged in assessment, it's 90 hours per experience. If you're engaged in training, it's 120 hours per experience. It's important for you all to know these stipulations or these hour guidance, because I often see schools when I've been out working in schools as they develop predetermined job sites for students with disabilities and just rotate students through these job sites, and they're in there for quite some time, sometimes throughout the whole year. And so it's really important that that's under 64 CO8. We really shouldn't be doing that. We need to make sure that when we're engaged in vocational exploration, when we're engaged in assessment, when we're engaged in training, that's really targeted and we have a specific goal in mind and we move on once we've met that goal. Okay. Third, placements in the community are clearly outlined within the individualized rehabilitation program. So you have to have either an IEP or an IPE, an individual plan for employment. That's what vocational rehabilitation uses, that lists the needed transition services established for vocational exploration. Okay. So if you're developing your IEP and your transition goals and objectives, outline what you're going to be doing and make sure it's clearly written. So for exploration, you don't need to outline like the specific job that an individual is going to be exploring, but you can just kind of outline job clusters. So if you have a student that's expressed interest in computers or whatever, or working with software, you could just say, the student is interested in working with computers, games, software, and the student will explore career opportunities participating in information interviews and job shadows in these environments. And then you go and engage in those exploration. Now, keep in mind, when you're engaged in exploration, this should be something that starts early on in the transition process. So once again, these experiences should be cumulative. So you start with exploration, you move into assessment, you move into training, then you go into paid work. So in terms of assessment, you could, and once you've done the exploration and you've kind of validated that a student is really interested in this work or working with computers, then you can move into assessment. And through assessment, you can set up a series of situational assessments to watch the student perform a variety of tasks or data entry tasks or whatever it may be that it's emerged through your exploration. And then once you've kind of done your assessments and seen what that individual is interested in and validated that that is indeed an interest, then you can move into job training and then engage in that job training goal. So you could say something like the student will increase 10 key data entry speed tests at the university library or whatever. So you're identifying in your transition plan, in your IEP goals and objectives, what that student will be working on. Fourth, that the individual with a disability is voluntarily participating in the community-based placement and that there's no expectation of payment, and all participants have to be fully informed of what you're working on. So once again, this reinforces what I'm going to be talking about here momentarily about us creating written agreements about what you're doing with businesses. Fifth, the employer must not gain immediate advantage to their business as a result of that individual's participation. And sixth, that students are not entitled to employment at the business at the conclusion of the experience or the conclusion of the IEP or IPE. So once again, Similar to the test for internships, this is set up to ensure that we're not entering into an employee-employer relationship during these unpaid job training experiences. So let's talk a little bit about volunteering. So in my work over the years, whether it's working with transition programs or working with community rehabilitation providers, those who work with vocational rehabilitation to provide supported employment or customized employment, I often hear folks use volunteering uh, to talk about the experiences students or their job seekers with disabilities are engaged in. And they use this term volunteering incorrectly. For example, I hear student or teachers and I hear CRPs say, oh, my student is volunteering at Walmart, or my student is volunteering at Pizza Hut. So it's really important that we get our language right. Under the Fair Labor Standards Act, you do not volunteer for a for-profit business. So when we're talking about the experiences that students are engaged in, we really have to make sure we're getting the language right. So if a student is engaged in a job training experience at Walmart, then let's label it as a job training experience at Walmart. Let's not label it as a volunteer experience at Walmart. So according to the Fair Labor Standards Act, volunteering occurs when an individual donates his or her time with no expectation of payment or employment. So you're volunteering your time. Typically, this occurs at a service club or a charitable organization or nonprofit organization, church, so on and so forth. So keep in mind that under this Fair Labor Standards Act, individuals cannot volunteer for a for-profit business or volunteer in commercial activities run by nonprofit organizations. So what does that mean? Say, for instance, you've set up an individual's has expressed interest in working with animals. And so you've worked with the local humane society, a nonprofit entity that works with animals, that works with animal adoptions. You've worked with with the nonprofit humane society, and they're like, yeah, let's have your student come in. We actually run a gift shop within the humane society where we sell things for profit, such as collars, dog foods, any accessory you need when you adopt a dog. We can have your student come in and help you know, help with making sure all the collars are aligned or making sure that all the inventory is correct or something along those lines. That is not volunteering. That would be unpaid job training. So if your student is engaged in an activity at a nonprofit business that they're doing something for profit, we can't have that student engaged. That would be an unpaid job training scenario. Finally, the person with a disability must be legally competent to freely volunteer his or her time or services. So hopefully that provides some context related to volunteering. And really what I want to stress to y'all is that if is to get your language right when you're talking about these experiences. If it's volunteering, it's a nonprofit charitable organization. If it's unpaid job training or internships, you're at a for-profit organization, for-profit business. So hopefully that provided some context with how you work within the Fair Labor Standards Act. And I want to provide just some general recommendations as you're setting up these work-based learning experiences. I conducted a study back in 2019 where I was working with employers or talking to employers about how we can improve work-based learning experiences for students with disabilities. So my colleague and I sent out a survey to employers and asked them about specific components of work-based learning experiences. A couple of these components I want to highlight for y'all. First and foremost, when you're setting up work-based learning experiences, employers really want to know that these experiences are part of an established work-based program. So it might be beneficial as you're setting up your programs to develop some documents or develop a flyer, a pamphlet that really outlines the scope of your program and what you're trying to achieve, with information about your program, what the work-based learning means, what the commitment of the employer is, what the commitment of the school is, that really talks about all the things that will pop up when you're starting to develop these experiences with employers. And I know firsthand, working with employers, that one of the first things that pop up when you start developing these work-based sites or workplace learning experiences for students with disabilities is liability. So if you could start talking about that in your pamphlet, ensure that all the questions that they may have are answered in this pamphlet, and that this is an established work-based training program, employers will be more receptive to working with you. Second, employers want a single point of contact. So when you're working with employers, give them the contact information of somebody that they can call to if there's a problem, if they have concerns, if they have questions about the work-based learning experience. They need to know who and how to contact a person. Perhaps most importantly is employers want a written training agreement that outlines the scope of training for each student. So this reinforces what I've been saying about internships and unpaid job training, that we really need to be better at developing written training agreements with employers that outlines what we're doing. Are we engaged in, well, in an internship? Are we engaged in an exploration? Are we engaged in assessment? Or are we engaged in training? Outlines how long this experience is going to be, what the student will be doing, who the contact information is, so on and so forth. Really important to develop written training agreement outlining the scope of training for each student. Then I want to move over to the salmon colored bar. Employers want individuals who are supporting students with disabilities to understand the essential functions of a business. So if you have job coaches, typically these are paraprofessionals who are working in transition programs, you really need to make sure that these paraprofessionals / job coaches really understand employment and how employment works. So this kind of aligns with some other studies that I've done related to employment and what employers think about working with service providers. And when an employer is engaged with a service provider and they feel like that service provider doesn't know anything about the business case or working in businesses or what happens in businesses, they're going to be reluctant to work with that provider. So I would highly recommend for any transition program that's developing quality work-based learning experiences that you specifically train your paraprofessionals and job coaches to understand the essential functions of the business and how to engage and work with employers. I would highly recommend that you develop training agreements, and I highly recommend that you develop some form of information about how you standardize your work-based training programs, and that this is a established program that your school administers. So to articulate the importance of all this, one of the employers in my study, we had them write some scenarios or what happened with work-based learning experiences that weren't very successful. So one of the employers wrote this, and I'm just going to read it to you because it really highlights the importance of establishing clear objectives, clear written agreements, and understanding how business works. So I had one student intern from a high school, and it was a nightmare because the school gave me no support or information at all. I received one phone call asking me if I was interested in an intern, and I said yes. One day, the student just showed up, and I had to get all my information about the program from the student who really didn't know anything. I was given no contact information for anyone at the school. The whole thing was so disappointing. I finally had to get really nasty with the school to finally get someone to show up and give me information. But by that time, the internship had ended. The teacher showed up at my business, handed me a packet that I should have received at the beginning of the internship, not at the end. That experience made me totally unwilling to work with schools here ever again. They are really putting these children at risk, as and the business owners. So I think this really highlights the importance of establishing a strong protocol for anything that we're doing regarding work-based learning experiences, and really professionalizing how we're engaging with businesses. So a couple recommendations as we conclude this webinar. First and foremost, I think I've already articulated this throughout this webinar, that the focus of everything that we do in regard to work-based learning experiences should be paid employment. It should be a cumulative process, starting with exploration, moving into assessment, moving into training, moving into paid employment. We are not engaging in work-based learning experiences to weed students out, to say somebody's not employable. We're engaging in employment experiences to discover a student's strengths, interests, and preferences, and align those to the activities that we're engaged in, so we can hopefully get a person a job prior to exiting, and a job that actually represents the demands of work in our community. So there are a lot more jobs than those F jobs that I talked about at the beginning of this webinar. You need to develop IEPs that reflect training goals and objectives related to the work-based learning experience. So this is important not only for 64C08, but also if you're establishing unpaid work internships, that you really need to tie what you're doing into your IEP goals and objectives. Create a written training agreement that outlines how the work-based learning experience meets specific provisions of the Fair Labor Standards Act, and have this signed by the student, parent, guardian, employer, and school representative. One of the best formats that I found was developed by the National Center on Secondary Education and Transition nearly 20 years ago. And I've included there's a copy here on this slide, but I've also included a link at the resources at the end of this webinar that really shows some of these agreements. So when you're developing your work-based learning experiences and activities for your students, I really, really recommend that you develop an agreement, tailor it based off this example, or maybe your school already has one, but make sure that you're utilizing these agreements as you move forward. So this is an example. As you can see, right at the beginning, it says, what are you doing? Are you engaged in career exploration? Are you engaged in career assessment? Are you engaged in work-related training? Finally, maintain records of the experience. So document the hours that the student spends in each work-based learning experience. So once again, going back to 64C08, there's specific hour requirements for exploration, assessment, and job training. So you need to be aware of where students are in terms of those hour stipulations. Collect data. So we cannot make good instructional decisions and good employment decisions without data that helps us understand what the student is engaged in. So there's a number of different formats that we can engage in from a customized employment perspective. If we're supporting an individual with more significant disabilities, we can use the discovery process and create a discovery staging record to really document where students are moving up, or where students are engaged in terms of certain activities. We can just collect basic situational type assessment data. There's a whole host of forms online that you can download and look at to collect specific instructional data summaries of student performance, and then look at progress. Really important that we don't just place a student in a work-based learning experience and not connect the dots and not look for progress. All too often, I see an individual engaged in a work-based learning experience that's not aligned with that student's strengths, interests, or preference, and they're just engaged in that experience because it's convenient. It's convenient for the school. So that goes back to like some of these established work sites that schools often have, where we rotate students through. That doesn't, in my mind, that doesn't make sense. That we should really be targeting these work-based experiences that are based on student individual needs and preferences. So hopefully this presentation provided you with some insights on what we should be doing in terms of work-based learning experiences, how we can align these experiences to the Fair Labor Standards Act, and the importance of establishing high-quality applied experiences to promote better outcomes for individuals with disabilities, particularly those with more significant disabilities. I've included a number of resources on this webpage or on this slide. Please take a look at them. They will certainly help as you're thinking through setting up work-based learning experiences. And then finally, my contact information, should you have any questions regarding anything that I've talked about throughout this webinar. And I also included my webpage that has a number of webinars, information sheets, and so on and so forth about setting up employment programs for individuals with disabilities. So thank you for your time and good luck with implementing your work-based learning experiences.